So we're going to cover the first 18 verses this morning in the book of Ruth, chapter 1. We've titled this, the series, The God Who Redeems, and the first installment this morning, Ruth and Naomi, part 1. So they're the ones that really kind of come into focus here in this first section. And the books of Judges and Ruth naturally go together. They take place during the same historical time in Israel, and yet, in pretty much every way, they couldn't be more opposite. The book of Ruth contains 85 verses, and 23 of them mention the Lord, so it's very rich with people talking to or about God. By way of these contrasts between Judges and Ruth, some of them have been pointed out by Arnold Fruchtenbaum, a well-known Bible teacher, and here are 8 that he highlights, 8 points of contrast. So the book of Judges is filled with immorality, whereas the book of Ruth is filled with fidelity and righteousness and purity. Second, the book of Judges contains a lot of idolatry, people going after other gods. However, in the book of Ruth, you see the true devotion and worship of the Lord come into focus. In Judges, there's this gradual decline, sometimes more rapid decline, and there's a lot of disloyalty, versus in Ruth, there is devotion. In Judges, there's lust. You see the relationships between men and women usually devolving into lustful, sinful ones, versus here in Ruth, you see the Lord's design and them being centered around love, particularly the one that will come into focus. In Judges, you have a lot of war and strife and problems, and in Ruth, you have a time of peace, or at least conditions of peace in a time characterized by war. In Judges, you have cruelty. In Ruth, you have kindness. In Judges, you have disobedience leading to judgment, one type after another, versus in Ruth, you have obedience leading to blessing. So those conditions set out in the book of Deuteronomy so clearly come into focus very readily in Judges on one hand and in Ruth on the other. And then eighth and finally, you have a time really of spiritual darkness in Judges, and then you have this bright spot of spiritual light described here in Ruth. Let's look at our text this morning. So starting in verse 1. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled, or the days that the judges judged, that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. So the first word in the book of Ruth is the Hebrew word vahi, and it's here in the New King James, it gets rendered as now it came to pass, but in Hebrew it really is and it was. It just kind of drops you into the story in this way. But it's also the same intro to the book of Judges, which also begins with the same word, vahi, and it was. And many other books in the Old Testament begin with this same introductory word as well. So it's a common theme throughout the Old Testament. And this word, vahi, with the repetition, how it starts the book, it provides continuity with all these other books of the Old Testament. And so, again, the Bible is great literature. And you can think of these introductory clauses, and it was, as basically like almost like a new chapter. A new chapter begins in this ongoing saga, and you have this developing story that God is revealing throughout His Word, and so it picks up and it just drops you right into the story. So it says, and it was in the days when the judges judged. So this tells us that this time that we've just been studying in the book of Judges is the exact same time in Israel in which this takes place. We're not told specifically when or which judge was judging Israel during this time, but one of them, we can take a stab at it. And so there's a famine going on, which could correlate with the time of Gideon back around Judges chapter 6, but it's hard to say with complete certainty. And we're introduced to the people who are in focus here in this passage, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. And so if you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 28, and I'm going to put it up here, we have some references to these conditions. Again, I think it's chapter 27, or earlier in 28 maybe. Yeah, the beginning of chapter 28 describes all these blessings in store for God's people that go with their obedience. And then starting in around verse 15, it starts to talk about the conditions of disobedience. And here it says, "But it shall come to pass, if you do not obey the voice of the Lord your God, to observe carefully all his commandments and all his statutes, which I command you today, that all these curses will come upon you and overtake you." Here's some of them listed. "And the heavens which are over your head shall be bronze, and the earth which is under your feet shall be iron. The Lord will change the rain of your land into powder and dust." Like a dust bowl. How terrible does that sound? You want rain and you get dust. "From the heaven it shall come down on you until you are destroyed. You shall carry much seed out to the field, but gather in little, for the locusts shall come and consume it. You shall plant vineyards and tend them, but you shall neither drink of the wine nor gather the grapes, for the worms shall eat them. You shall have olive trees throughout all your territory, but you shall not anoint yourself with the oil, for your olives shall drop off." And so, again, these conditions are directly associated with the people's disloyalty, disobedience, idolatry. And so that sets the stage for what's going on here in Bethlehem, which is chock full of irony, we should note, because they're from Bethlehem, and the word Bethlehem, the name of the city, actually means house of bread. So there's a famine in the house of the bread. So right there you have this agricultural region that's not as it should be, and that strikes us as odd right off the bat, but it's consistent with these conditions that God has brought by way of judgment for their unfaithfulness and their idolatry. So what this tells us is that the famine was in the land and they exit the land. Now this is contains a lot for us. It tells us that life was extremely difficult for their family in these famine conditions described in Deuteronomy chapter 28. If we can kind of internalize what they were going through, this man and his family, they were presumably hungry and frustrated and desperate. They'd been planting and not reaping the harvest. They didn't have enough food to eat. They were growing more and more desperate, and all they could see was that their conditions were deteriorating. And so it made them want to find something, anything else, elsewhere. And because of the famine, the family here, we're introduced to them. It's this man and his wife and his 2 sons. And it says they moved to the land of Moab. And they went to dwell there. They went to sojourn there. So they went not to relocate there permanently, but to stay there for a time to kind of get through this famine. So they go to Moab, presumably to get through the duration of the famine. And let's look at verse 2 here. The name of the man was Elimelech, which means God is my king. The name of his wife was Naomi, And the names of his two sons were Machlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to the country of Moab and remained there. So they immediately, we see something that we have to point out, we have to call out. There's something very, very wrong right off the bat. So the conditions of the book of Judges were bad enough, but now look what we have. You have a mistake. The mistake is this, that Elimelech encountered a problem, but he didn't wait prayerfully for the Lord to tell him what to do next. He just up and left. So he and his family go 50 miles to the east, and to do this, they have to go outside the promised land, right? God had brought them into the promised land. They take themselves voluntarily out of the promised land and into the land of Moab. Now, Moab is one of their enemies, so this is obviously a problem. They left God's land and God's people to go live in enemy territory among enemy people. Warren Wiersbe says, no matter how difficult our circumstances may be, the safest and best place is in the will of God. You can't run away from your problems. And so what this reveals right off the bat is a lack of trust. The books of Judges, and then now Ruth, as well as 1 Samuel after that, are really set during this low point in the time of the Judges. There's division, there's crime, cruelty, human suffering, spiritual apostasy, idolatry, civil war, foreign oppression, a terrible economy, and really just national disgrace, and people are at a very, very low point. But even in the midst of all of this, God was still at work in Israel. And his love for his people was unchanged. He had allowed all of these hard circumstances to come about in their society because of what he's doing. He's calling them back to himself. And we can be reassured that God still had a plan and a future for the people of Israel. He is the God who does not give up. He redeems. And today, just as then, even in those terrible days when the judges judged and everyone did what was right in their own eyes, God still loves lost and broken people living in this messed up world, and that is exactly what we see here in this passage. So the response here by Elimelech and Naomi was the wrong response. Essentially, I look around me, I see problems, and my reaction is I better just run away and try to find something better somewhere else, anywhere else, even if it means going someplace that I really don't think I'm supposed to go. And so ultimately, God is going to redeem their wrong decision for his glory, but they're still going to have to suffer under the weight of the consequences of the bad decision that they made out of their discontentment. We're told here that they go in verses 1 and 2 to the land of Moab, or the country of Moab, or the plains of Moab is what it says there in the Hebrew. They go to this area which is east of the Dead Sea. So basically, just directly to the east of Bethlehem. However, they would have had to go up and around the top of the Dead Sea in order to get there. So it would have been a little bit of a trek to the north, and then also down into the Dead Sea Valley and up. And so it would be quite a journey. It would take a little while to make this journey. And Moab, you might recall from Genesis chapter 19, if you've been reading along in your Bible this year, you probably read this already, or if not, I'm sure you're familiar with it, but in the account of Sodom and Gomorrah, and things just go completely haywire for Lot, and his daughters try to take control of the situation. What ends up happening is that Moab is the son of Lot by way of a shocking and incestuous birth, and that's where the nation of Moab comes from, along with the Ammonites. And so in Judges chapter 3, we've already seen that Eglon was the king of Moab, and he was killed in this stealthy assassination by one of the judges, Ehud. And during this time when the judges judged in Israel, the relationship between Israel and Moab seems stable. It just kind of going off of the pointers, the markers that we get here in the book of Ruth, it seems they don't seem to be at war at this particular time. The Moabite religion was quite similar to the Canaanites. They worshipped their own gods, several gods. Their primary god was Chemosh, along with his wife Ashtar, and there were other gods that they worshipped, including Baal also. So let's look at verse 3 here. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. So right off the bat, things start to go south. They try to escape a bad situation and are met with tragedy right off the bat. And so this is going to be a difficult blow for Naomi. And then we're gonna see what happens next. But again, Elimelech, his name means my God is king, or God is my king. And what we see, though, from his decision making already is that there's no mention of God in his decision. He seems to make this on his own. Now, the sons' names are, verse 2, Machlon and Kilion, which you'll notice immediately they rhyme. And so it does bring the question to mind, were they twins? Right? A lot of people will do that if they have twins. They like to make their names rhyme. So that's certainly a possibility. But their names tell us a lot. Their names speak to the fact that they probably were not in very good health. Their names mean something like sickly and runt. So it's not good. It tells you they're probably not the healthiest guys in the world. And the residents of the town of Bethlehem is where they began their journey, and it tells us that they were of the tribe of Judah, Ephrathites being sort of this old-time historical name for what would become Bethlehem. And let's look at verse 4 here. Now, so their dad, Elimelech, actually dies once they're in this land. And after this, it says, now Machlon and Kilion took wives of the women of Moab. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they went and they dwelt there about 10 years. So the question right off the bat is, were they or were they not supposed to marry Moabite wives? If you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1 through 3, there's a prohibition about marrying a lot of ites, the Canaanites and all these other people, the Hittites and the Perizzites. However, there's no mention of the Moabites, and so it's kind of a gray area, I guess. It wasn't expressly prohibited, so they weren't doing something completely wrong. However, if you go to Deuteronomy 23, verse 3, there is a statement about how God viewed the Moabites in light of their prior treatment of his people as they were passing through their land, and they were treated horribly, and into that, or because of that, the Moabites were permanently banned from participating in the official events of the nation of Israel. It's of being part of the assembly, I think is the language used there in Deuteronomy 23. So all of this, bottom line, if you boil it down, it means that Ruth and Orpah, it wasn't necessarily wrong of them to marry them, but they kind of would have to stay here in the land of Moab. They weren't really encouraged to go back into the land of Israel. Let's look at verse 5. Then both Machlon and Kilion also died. So the woman survived. The woman survived her 2 sons and her husband. So if the book of Judges didn't leave us just kind of feeling like things couldn't get any worse in Israel, now you start the book of Ruth and you're going, oh boy. You got Israelites experiencing a famine. Israelites just up and deciding to leave the land and go outside the promised land and live among their enemies. You've got them taking wives of the Moabites, which is kind of this questionable decision. And then you have the father, Elimelech, dies, and then you have Machlon and Chilion dies, and you think, wow, this is just a continuation of the book of Judges. It's just going to go from bad to worse, and I don't see any particular hope in sight at this point. The phrase here in verse 5 or verse 4, they took wives of the women of Moab, it's really interesting to look at the Hebrew words. Nasa, Isha are the words, or the root words. They took wives for themselves is basically what it says. And Nasa is used instead of lekach, which is the normal word to take a wife to be married. And so Nasa literally means to lift up. And it's the same word we just saw at the end of Judges chapter 21, verse 23, when these Benjaminites were carrying their wives, kidnapping them. And you're going, oh, this is not good. So this construction here, Nasa with Isha, wherever it occurs throughout the Old Testament, always has a negative connotation associated with it. So what this tells us is that the Machlon and Chilion did not follow, just as the Benjaminites did not follow, the proper way to go about a marriage in this day. They didn't follow the cultural conventions of the day, even the ones that existed in Moab that were considered proper and customary, and the ceremonial things that they would go through, and the family involvement that they would go through. They just seemed to have found women they liked and skipped over all that, and off they went. So it seems like these were not great guys. They weren't particularly honorable. They didn't seem to be particularly God-fearing. And we also get the fact that they're probably in poor health. And so the irony of verses 4 and into verse 5 here is that they had fled to Moab to try to escape death, but in Moab all the men meet an early death. So, they tried to save their lives from this famine. They thought the famine was going to kill them. And so now they flee to Moab, and they experience death in the land of Moab, the very thing they were trying to avoid. So what we find here is that their problems were not with their external circumstances. That their bigger problems that they were dealing with were discontentment and lack of trust, meaning that their problems were internal. I like this quote by Oswald Chambers, who says, the majority of us begin with the bigger problems outside, the ones that we feel, I'm inserting my own commentary into this quote, we feel pressing on us and weighing on us. Back to his quote, whereas the bigger problems are not outside, we forget the one inside. And the Hebrew seems to state that they lived in Moab for 10 years. That's the total period of time. Let's move on to verse 6 here. It says that they lived there for 10 years. Now, something to be noted here is, I'm going to skip ahead here, then for about 10 years, there we go, verse 4, they dwelt there about 10 years, so that seems to be the entire time they lived there. How long they had taken these wives and were married for, we're not sure. It could have been toward the end of this 10 years, and so they don't have children, so it kind of lends itself to the idea that maybe these marriages didn't last very long. They could have been quite short. But there's also another component that goes along with this that I think is worth mentioning. And if you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 28 and these curses for disobedience. Note one of them. On the flip side, earlier in Deuteronomy 28, there's this blessing associated with obedience, but then there's also this curse associated with disobedience. Cursed shall be the fruit of your body and the produce of your land, the increase of your cattle and the offspring of your flocks. And so this seems to be a statement of infertility associated with disobedience. And I don't want to get any misunderstanding on this, because lots of individual married couples, maybe some of us in this room have experienced infertility, and it's definitely a difficult and painful thing to go through on an individual married couple level. But this seems to be speaking of a national level, that there would be widespread infertility across the nation as a result of their disobedience. And the idea is you want to forsake me and go after other gods. You want to do everything you're not supposed to do. Your perspective is really not one of desiring children. Then fine, you're just not going to have very many of them. And so we kind of saw that already in Judges, that they had trouble mustering an army compared to earlier in their history. That this may have been a condition that was even widespread at this time as part of not only the famine and the other conditions outlined in Deuteronomy 28, but part of just the curse on their nation. A nation isn't going to last very long without subsequent generations. And so that's a possibility I'm just throwing out there. It's not explicitly stated in our text, but it may be part of a larger issue going on in the nation. Verse 6, then she arose, this is Naomi, with her daughters-in-law, that she might return from the country of Moab. For she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. So Naomi hears that the Lord had come to the aid of his people. The famine in Bethlehem had ended. And so this was what they were trying to wait out. We're not told how many months or years earlier it had actually ended, but she finally gets the word that it has ended, and it seems to correspond with this exact point when she's got to quickly figure out what she's going to do. Her prospects here in Moab are not looking good. And so it says that God had visited. And in the Old Testament, when God visits his people, it can be good or it can be bad, depending on really the spiritual conditions of the nation. And so what this tells us is there seems to be some hope in Bethlehem for God to have lifted this condition of famine, of judgment, and giving them crops to harvest, giving them food once again. And so she starts making preparations to return. The Hebrew word shub, to return or to turn around, to turn back is the word. And so on one, there's the initial level, the physical level, that she is getting ready to move. But there's also the spiritual level that kind of has overtones here as well in terms of her family and her spiritual life. She's got to humble herself in the sense of coming to terms with the bad decisions previously made and where it led her. Let's look at verse 7. Therefore she went out from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her. So they start on their journey. They went on the way to return to the land of Judah. So they set out on the road. And then verse 8, and while they're starting out on this journey, Naomi stops them. And she says to her 2 daughters-in-law, just go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. So Naomi, really what this is here is she instructs them not to come with her, but to go back to the land of Moab, to the homes of their parents. And then the second half of verse 8 is really basically a prayer. It's a prayer invoking the Lord's blessing on them. The Lord, Jehovah, his covenant name, deal kindly with you as you have dealt with me and with the as you have dealt with the dead and with me. So Naomi prays, asking the Lord to show kindness. Chesed is the Hebrew word that comes into focus here, to Ruth and Orpah, and to meet them in the midst of their suffering. And I think what's so special about this prayer is that the rest of the book of Ruth, as it unfolds, we see God answering this prayer, at least for Ruth. We don't know exactly what happens with Orpah, but there's no particular reason to think that God didn't answer this prayer for Orpah as well as she goes back, whatever that entailed, in the land of Moab. So Naomi here recognizes something as well. Look at the final clause there, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. So she sees this characteristic of chesed, of God's faithfulness, on display in these two young women, that they have already dealt with her, with Naomi, in this way. They've modeled this for her. Their love and their devotion went above and beyond what was required. Let's move on into verse 9 here. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. So this begs the question here, why would Naomi encourage these two young Moabite women to abandon her? Why is she sending them away and specifically sending them back to stay in the land of Moab? I think there's probably three reasons that we should note here that come into view as far as why she likely did this. Number one, just read the book of Judges, right? The conditions in the book of Judges were horrible for women in the land of Israel. We've just seen, this really devolving of the care and concern for women in Israel to the point where now we see them being murdered, butchered. It's terrible. The conditions are highly unsafe for women during this time of the Judges because violent crime was escalating and it was not a safe place for widowed young women. So that's probably one concern. There's also a second concern that has to come into play here, and that is the condition of Naomi's shame. Because for her to have left the land, to gone and lived in the land of the Moabites, their enemies, and to make a questionable decision, if not that was a foolish decision, but then a questionable decision as far as allowing her sons to marry Moabite women. If they stayed behind and she goes back by herself, she never has to talk about it. She never even has to acknowledge that any of that ever happened. All they would know is that she was gone for a while and came back. But if she comes back with one or two Moabite women, all of a sudden the town's going to be talking. And she's going to have to come to terms with everything that happened, and she's not going to be able to cover her shame and her guilt for her bad decisions at that point. So there might be some kind of self-preservation going on at that point, trying to send them back. There's also a third reason that might come into play, and that's as if she returns alone and destitute and suffering, she might get an extra amount of sympathy or perhaps extra assistance, extra help from the people of Bethlehem. They realize that she is just one of the poorest of the poor, the most outcast of society, and maybe she can get some extra help. Whereas if she brings back two young women with her, that's a different set of circumstances. Maybe she isn't looked at as quite so destitute. So hard to know, but these are three possible conditions as far as why she would be inclined not to want these young women to come back with her. A fourth reason, obviously, is her concern for them. I think that's probably legitimate, that she feels like coming back into Israel, nobody's going to marry Moabite women. They don't really even want them there. They're not even supposed to be there. They might be subject to social ostracizing, and their prospects are better in the land of Moab of getting remarried, and the condition there in verse 9 says that you may find rest. And in the context, the rest is associated with getting remarried. Now, that's not to say that if they got remarried, that their lives would be easy, or doesn't mean that they would not have to work, but it's a way of acknowledging that afforded them a certain amount of security and stability. So in the ancient Near East, there weren't a ton of job opportunities for women. And a widow was in a very difficult spot because her job prospects were very limited, almost non-existent, and she would always lack provision and protection. However, by getting remarried, she could find that provision and protection and security. And that's always been one thing that we should note as far as just God's design for marriage, is that is a proper role for husbands to provide and protect and provide security and stability for their family to the best that they can with the Lord's help, and that in financially and in safety and in all of these other areas, you can look and you can see that following God's design by both parties is a good and preferable and desirable condition that God has designed. And so she wants this for them. She wants them to find a better outcome. Let's look at verse 10. And they said to her, "Surely we will return with you to your people." They're already on the road. They're already walking back with her. And so they're like, no, we appreciate that, but we're going to go with you. In verse 11, but Naomi said, again, second time, "Turn back, my daughter." She wants them to go back to the land of Moab. "Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb that they may be your husbands?" She basically is kind of alluding at this point to the idea of levirate marriage as described in Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 through 10. That if the inheritance was a really important concept in Israel. God had apportioned the land by tribe. And within those large portions, individual families would have their portions, and then they would pass it down as an inheritance. That portion of land would get passed on and passed on and passed on. But if there's no descendants, it doesn't get passed on. And so it's instantly a huge problem, because this family can basically just be cut out of God's blessing to them, their inheritance, their portion of land within the promised land. And so God made this provision to where basically the younger brother could come along, marry the woman, and then that inheritance that would belong to the older brother would be able to be passed on. And the language here is interesting. It's an imperfect. Why will you go with me? It's an imperfect of, we could say, undesirability. Why would you want to go with me, is what she's asking. Why would you want to do that? And so she's obviously trying to discourage this. But with God's provision, he made provision to where people or property that were lost, like let's say, someone did lose their land, and that was a big deal. That was a big problem in Israel. There was a mechanism through the law of redemption where it could be recovered by a payment of a certain fee, usually by a relative. So these are some of the background concepts that are kind of in Naomi's mind as she's putting this out there. Like, why would you even want to do that? She's basically saying that even if I were to, let's say, get married and have a baby, and then for him to grow up and for you guys to marry him, like that would just be such a long time. That's absurd, is what she's saying at this point. "Turn back, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I say I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight, and should bear sons. Would you want to wait for them till they were grown? Why would you restrain yourself from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. So you see Naomi's grief at this point, so much so that she attributes this to the hand of the Lord, not necessarily disciplining the entire people or the bad decisions that her family has made, but just that she feels that God has been against her, and you see her basically becoming angry with God. However, set in the context of everything we know about Naomi, she seems to be a genuine woman of faith. And so what we acknowledge here is that in terms of her faith, she's struggling. She's struggling between what she knows to be true and the pain and the grief that she's experiencing, and the intersection of this causes her to make this kind of a statement, that the Lord has gone out against me. She's angry with God at this point. And for you and I, when we go through those gut-wrenching things in life, such as we can only imagine the pain that Naomi is experiencing through the loss of her husband and her 2 sons, we might experience this same emotion. Maybe you have experienced it in the past. Maybe you will experience it in the future. But the key thing is not to let it shake your faith, because God can handle even your anger directed at Him. His shoulders are broad. I want to make this point. His shoulders are broad, and His mercy and patience are great. So we don't want to think that in that moment where even if we are struggling between what we know to be true and what we're experiencing, and it comes to this this kind of a statement of what we're feeling and what we're expressing, don't panic. Put this up here. Even though we experience suffering in this fallen world, when we go through suffering, God is not our enemy, but our ally, whose purposes we don't understand, and who can bring unexpected things out of our present pain. So this is a momentary condition for Naomi. She blames God. She's angry with God because her world has come crashing down, and the faith that she has, she's struggling to maintain, and the perspective that she wants to have, she's struggling to have, and what she knows to be true and what she feels are coming into conflict, and it's causing her to become angry with God, feeling like He must just be having a heavy hand on her, and she doesn't understand, and she's frustrated, she's in terrible grief and pain, and it comes out expressing itself as anger toward God. Looking at verse 14, now we see the first one of these daughters come into view. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So initially, just the cultural context, apparently when Naomi kisses both of them, that is their kiss goodbye. And for them to return that kiss means they're acknowledging that kind of a sending away. And so that's what Orpah does. She returns the kiss. She acknowledges that she's been told twice. But then Ruth, oddly, it says, but Ruth clung to her. She was going to stick to her like glue. So in Orpah's defense, Orpah, tends to take a lot of heat in this situation, but in her defense, she does heed the counsel of an older woman of faith who she respects. So, she hasn't done anything wrong. And without a husband and without sons to take care of her, Naomi is helpless. She is going to be destitute at this point. But what we observe from Ruth is that Ruth loved her and she refused to let her go through the rest of her life completely alone and helpless. So she decided and she determined that she would stick with her and take care of Naomi no matter what. Arnold Fruchtenbaum says, Orpah did the sensible thing and the expected thing. Ruth did the extraordinary thing and the unexpected thing. So we start to see something special about Ruth come into view, that she's not required to do this. In fact, everything she's being told is to not do this. But she still has made up her mind and she's determined. Verse 15, and she said, so this is Naomi talking to Ruth, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. So for the third time, Ruth has to be told, go. You need to go back. Look at, she's going. Go back. One thing that we should note here is that in this particular time, that each of the nations had their own god or gods. And the view was that those gods held power only in that particular geographical area where they were worshipped by those particular people. And so Naomi doesn't necessarily, she doesn't worship the gods of the Moabites. She doesn't believe that they have any power from what we can tell, but she acknowledges the view of the people of this land and of all the different countries of this area, that those were the accepted gods by those people, by the Moabite people, and she refers to them as her gods. Go back to your people and to your gods, she tells her. But what's curious is that once people left that geographical area, they also believed that they were coming out from under the area that was associated with, that was ruled by that god or those particular gods. So to leave one's land also automatically meant leaving one's own gods. Now they might still bring that worship mentality with them, the idea of still continuing to worship certain idols, and we see that with Rachel. She brings the household idol, and she's leaving the land of her home, and so she's bringing her religious views with her, and that certainly is an age-old practice. But Ruth seems to have this perspective without the baggage, without the idea that she's going to try to hang on to the gods of the Moabites. She understands that she's crossing over boundaries, but she's ready to embrace the God of the Hebrew people. And she pledges her allegiance to him, even though I would submit at this point that she may not have known a whole lot about him. She really, she's heard of him. She knows certain things from Naomi and the family, but she doesn't really probably have an existing relationship. It's hard to know. Maybe she did, but it seems like she's just ready to see where this goes. She's ready to embrace Naomi's God. She sees something special there. And so everything in Ruth's life says, in Naomi's life, everything in Naomi's life says that her life was terrible and that the only smart thing she could do was to cut her losses and to head back to Moab. And she expresses it in a certain way by saying, Ruth said, entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you, for wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge, and your people will be my people, and your God, my God. In verse 17, where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. She's all in. She's committed. And what's so powerful here in this statement, I mean, this is one of the most powerful declarations of faithfulness in the entire Bible. And Ruth, this Moabite woman, in the midst of this terrible time when the judges judged and there was widespread idolatry in the land of Israel, she invokes the name of Jehovah, the covenant name of the God of Israel, also known as Yahweh. And she speaks in the formulation of this oath that would be a standard formula that invites punishment directly on her if she doesn't follow through, if she doesn't fulfill what she promises to do. So this is very, very, very strong language here. We see that what Ruth says she means. She has no intention of leaving Naomi to fend for herself and to suffer and to end up destitute. She needs somebody to take care of her in her retirement years, and she says, where you go, I will go, all the way till death. Nothing is going to deter me from doing this and seeing this all the way through. I think what we see from Ruth is that she had learned already something. She may not have really had this robust faith. Maybe it was just in its infancy at this point, but she had learned the most important thing, and that was she was learning how to walk by faith and not by sight. This is the very thing that is so commended in Scripture of Abraham. He had to go to an unknown land. He had to go to an unknown people. He had a promise from the Lord, and he just was willing to obey. And he was willing to walk by faith and not by sight. When we do this, when we implement this concept in our own lives of walking by faith and not by sight, everything can seem scary and unknown and uncertain and maybe not a good idea. People are telling us it's a terrible idea, it's going to fail, it's never going to work. Whatever the blowback is, if we're able to take this approach of walking by faith and not by sight, it does three things. One, it glorifies God. Number two, it provides a powerful testimony to others. They see this unorthodox approach. You're going to do that? Why are you going to do that? That doesn't make any sense. That seems like a terrible idea. Everything is, surrounding you says, don't do that. Number three, it's like lifting spiritual weights. It strengthens our faith in God. The more we put this into practice, walking by faith and not by sight, we get accustomed to walking by faith and not by sight. We get accustomed of relying on the Lord and trusting in Him and seeing that He is faithful to see us through and that we can count on Him. So this brings us to our next thing we want to note, and that is that God would always act in love and compassion and faithfulness. And that really, this is so profound if we wrap our minds around this, that God is always faithful. He is always going to come through. But what it comes down to is us, and just like the people we're reading about here in the book of Ruth, are we going to trust Him? Are we going to trust that He's already got the end in mind, that He's already got the solution, that He's already going to see us through, that He's already made a way? It's already a done deal. He's completely faithful. It's just, are we willing to take that step of trusting Him with the future, with what we don't know, the unknown? We need to remember that God specializes in showing mercy to the least likely people, in the least likely places, and in the least likely way. That He acts out of His own character. He is faithful. He is merciful. He's true. He's loving. He's compassionate. He is just. He sees. And he is completely faithful. He's trustworthy. But sometimes we get ideas in our head of of what it's going to look like for God to come through, what it's going to look like for God to answer those prayers, what it's going to look like for God to provide the assistance that we want or that we need. And God doesn't necessarily work within those constraints. He may, but he also more likely will surprise us by working in an unlikely way, something that we didn't expect. Verse 18, finally, when she saw that she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her. So Naomi resigns herself at this point that this is happening. So all of those conditions, it wasn't safe, that she had to swallow her pride and she had to come face to face with her shame. And, the conditions might be better back in Moab for Ruth. And the other one that we outlined was that she may have to give up some of the extra sympathy that she hoped to get by arriving solo. She has to put all that behind and wrap her mind around, okay, this is happening, we're going together. And so she quiets herself and she resigns herself to this, that Ruth is going with her. Now what we're going to see next time is the language she uses when she gets back to Bethlehem is interesting, but we'll close with this. And that is, even in the darkest days of Israel's history, God was still at work through a remnant of a few faithful people who honored him. Ruth and Naomi fit this category. Even though everything else was a disaster in the nation of Israel, it was the time when the judges judged. Everybody did what was right in their own eyes. The conditions were deteriorating socially, economically, spiritually, every way. They were a train wreck. But there was still a remnant. There were still a few people who honored God. And even though we also live in a world that's often godless and dark, we also have an opportunity to be a light by demonstrating the same kind of selfless, faithful, loyal love to others, by doing what we see here with Ruth, placing others' needs above our own. We're going to leave off right there for this week and pick up in verse 19 next week. But I think this speaks something so profound about the character of God. We see that even though things looked bleak, even though things seemed hopeless for Naomi, we know that God was still working. Even though it seemed like this was just a continuation of the conditions we're reading about in Judges of death and destruction, and things going from bad to worse, and conditions going downhill, God is faithful. And even through this difficult time, he was working through a small remnant. And it was those people who would make the difference. It was those through whom he would work. It wasn't through the conditions of the vast many. It was through the small contingent who were trusting in him. And that's no different today either. Sometimes we think, wow, this world is so messed up. This world is so lost. It's so broken. It's so filled with everything that is so antithetical to the will and the ways of God. It embraces death, and it seems to reward corruption. And everything is just, greed seems to win the day, and oppression wins out, and all the things that just drive us nuts. God is still working, and he is using those who are faithful to be a light in the darkness, and God is at work, and he is doing great things. A small amount of faith can be used in a profound and powerful way by the Lord. If you're here this morning and you don't know him, he's the God who is in charge. He's in control of all things, and he's faithful and true. And he's the God who rescues. He's the God who comes through. He's the God who delivers. Why would any of us need that? Well, it's because we're all broken. We're all lost. We're all afflicted with sin. We understand that we're sinners, and that makes us fall under a penalty that is going to be real problematic for us. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. The wages of sin is death and eternal separation from God, and having to suffer the consequences of our greatest of all of our sins, and that is rejection. If we reject God's provision of rescue, it's like telling the lifeguard, "No, leave me alone. I'm fine." Well, you're gonna drown, and it's gonna be your own decision. And we all have a decision to make. And the provision that God made is His Son, the one who is the faithful one, the one who came to save, the rescuer, the redeemer. Jesus Christ came to this earth, fully God and fully man, perfect in every way, no sin at all. He fulfilled all that was required of Him, and He voluntarily laid down His life for you. He went to the cross. He was crucified. He died. He was buried, but death could not hold Him. He rose again. He was resurrected 3 days later. He triumphed over sin and death and the grave and sin's penalty, and He set us free. He paid our ransom. He died in our place. And if you've never trusted in His provision for you on the cross, of His sacrifice for you, Him dying for you so that you could live, so that you could be set free, so that you could be forgiven, so you could be pardoned, you could be given eternal life, I pray that you will make that decision. You will receive that gift this morning before you leave this place. Let's close in prayer and we'll have our final song. Father, thank you for this time that we've had in these first verses of the book of Ruth. I pray, Lord, that this study would be encouraging to us and it would show us a lot about who you are, your character, your faithfulness, and what you can do through a faithful few as well. Lord, I pray that you would take these things and help us to apply them no matter what we're going through, that we would find our strength in you, remembering you as the one who is faithful. Help us to have the faith to trust you. Lord, I pray that you would guide and bless each of us here into these things we've studied. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.